Happy spring, everyone. Well, almost. 'Tis the season for us Pacific Northwesterners to glimpse a light at the end of the tunnel of our dreary winter months. Now I walk around my neighborhood and everything smells like flowers. The bees are buzzing. Cherry trees burst into bloom around this time of year at the Oregon State Capitol in Salem and in Portland's Japanese-American Historical Plaza along the Willamette River. And at the Kiyokawa family orchards in the Hood River Valley, the apples are beginning to grow.
Well, springtime, I think, is a lot of people's favorites. It's when the trees start to wake up from being dormant. Over the wintertime, the buds start to swell.
That's Randy Kiyokawa. He's a third-generation fruit orchardist in Parkdale, Oregon.
For us growers, it's a chance to go and assess to see what the crop might look like. It's a time for hope, time for dreaming, and time for prep.
Connie Kiryu is Randy's sister. She thinks of the springtime blooms on the family orchard as what she calls popcorn trees.
It would just be this white popcorn all over the valley. And then sometimes it would turn pink with apple blossoms and the other blossoms.
Randy and Connie both grew up on this orchard. Their family has been growing apples and other fruit in this area for generations. The Kiyokawas are part of a rich history behind the Hood River apples so many Northwesterners love to eat. Japanese immigrants like Randy and Connie's grandparents were part of a vibrant community of Japanese-American orchardists in the Hood River Valley in the early 20th century. They also survived the forced relocation and incarceration of people of Japanese descent during World War II. They were one of the few Japanese-American families from the area able to return to work the land. They've now been growing in the valley for more than a century. Today, they operate a beloved family-owned orchard, once named the best apple orchard in America.
Hood River apples have really symbolized the highs and the lows of my hometown.
From the Gert Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. Today, how the Kiyokawa family created an apple paradise in the shadow of Mount Hood, now one of the few remaining Japanese-American-owned orchards in the Hood River Valley. OPB video producer Jeff Kastner has been eating the Kiyokawa family's apples for years and recently joined Randy and his family for an entire growing season at the orchard for OPB's Oregon Experience and Super Abundant series. Jeff, how did you meet the Kiyokawa family and get to know them?
I first met Randy Kiyokawa years ago. I was doing some filming on another show that I work on, Grant's Getaways. And we were doing a feature on things to do in the Hood River Valley in the fall, which included picking apples at Kiyokawa family orchards. I met Randy, and he showed off a bunch of his types of apples. And seeing the scenic location right at the base of Mount Hood, I was so impressed that I had to bring my family back there as soon as I could. And it became sort of an annual tradition that we would go up there every fall and pick apples. Bringing my family back there over the years, we realized we actually had a couple of family connections. My wife's side of the family is from Hawaii, and Randy has some family connections there as well. And we found out that Randy's mom and my wife's grandmother were actually incarcerated at the same camp during World War II, Tule Lake in Northern California, just south of Klamath Falls.
Wow.
Over the years, I learned a little bit more about their story, how they were able to get their land back after World War II and continue farming, and had always thought that that would be a really impactful story to tell.
My grandfather started farming in 1911, and our family's been in the farming business here in the valley since then.
The Kiyokawa family was one of many Japanese immigrant families that established themselves in the Hood River Valley in the early 20th century.
By 1910, Hood River actually had the largest population of Japanese outside Portland.
That's Linda Tamura. Her family has ties in the valley too. She's third generation Sansei, and has written 2 books about Japanese Americans in the Hood River Valley. She says Japanese residents played a big part in growing one of the area's most beloved crops.
Hood River had a reputation for the quality of its apples from the late 1890s and early 1900s.
In the 1880s, the Federal Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese workers from emigrating to the United States. So Japanese workers were being sought for work instead.
Japan was allowing Japanese to emigrate, and the Japanese economy was not good at that time. And so with permission from their country and with advertisements in the United States seeking workers, many of them left their country.
Japanese immigrants began working on the railroads and in stockyards, canneries, and fisheries. Railroad work brought some of them to the Hood River Valley, where workers who could help clear trees to make way for fruit orchards were also in demand.
It was difficult labor. They were paid less than other workers, but it was twice the income that they would have made in Japan.
And those jobs sometimes provided immigrant workers the opportunity to get a few acres of land for themselves.
And when they came to Hood River and saw the fruit trees and looked up at the mountain, there was Mount Hood. And for many of them, it was reminiscent of Mount Fuji in Japan.
So many stayed there and began growing fruit themselves. In the years before World War II, Tamura says Japanese growers dealt with animosity from white residents and persecution by the government. Even still, by 1940, Japanese Americans owned 8% of Hood River's acreage and produced 25% of its fruit. Jeff, now I know this growth of Japanese communities in the Hood River Valley was happening right around the time Randy's grandfather came to town. What did you learn about how the Kiyokawas first came to the valley and started growing apples?
Randy's grandfather, Riichi, first came to the U.S. in 1905.
He didn't have enough money to make the trip all the way from Japan to the United States, so he stopped in Hawaii. And that's where he cut sugarcane.
And then made his way to California, worked on the railroads, and continued working his way up the West Coast and eventually landed in the Hood River Valley.
It was an area that had a lot of opportunity. It was all old growth at that time. The lumber, the trapping of furs, all that was very exciting.
He started working on the orchards of some of the landowners who were already there. And eventually, in 1911, he was able to purchase a small plot of land of his own. Randy shared with us that in those early days, it took much longer for an apple tree to start producing fruit. So what his grandfather and other farmers did was to plant other types of crops in between the rows of apple trees. They planted things like strawberries and asparagus to give themselves an income while they're waiting for the apple trees to mature.
And I know that my grandfather did that. In fact, in the orchard we have here, you see some volunteer asparagus plants popping up.
More and more Japanese orchardists were finding success in the Hood River Valley. But things changed quickly for the valley's Issei, first-generation Japanese immigrants, and their families after Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 1941.
It was such a shock. They couldn't believe that the country of their birth was at war with the country where they now lived. These Issei planned to live in the United States. Their children were born here. They were American citizens. This was their home.
Immediately, there were repercussions for Japanese people in Oregon. They were required to carry ID at all times and follow a mandatory curfew. Another Japanese American from the Hood River Valley, Minoru Yasui, famously defied that curfew in Portland and eventually got arrested. His resulting conviction wasn't overturned in court until after his death. Then, on February 19th, 1942,
President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and that maintained that Issei And it later turned out the second generation Nisei citizens as well would be removed from their homes and sent to concentration camps on American soil.
Many Issei and Nisei from Hood River were first sent by train to a temporary detention center called Pinedale before being incarcerated at the notorious Tule Lake concentration camp in Northern California.
Tule Lake was a dry lake bed, and it was unconscionably hot, dry. They just weren't prepared. Each room had a potbelly stove, army cots with thin mattresses, a single light bulb, and the family lived there together. Life was just hard.
Like others from the Hood River Valley, Randy's grandparents and his father, Mamoru Kiyokawa, or MAM for short, ended up at Tule Lake. And that's where
Mom and Dad met.
MAM met Michiko Kiyokawa, or Mitch.
Just call me Mitch.
Mitch is the oldest living member of the Kiyokawa family. How would you describe her, Jeff?
Mitch is incredible. She turned 101 last fall.
Oh my gosh.
She walks 2 miles every day while she listens to her favorite Elvis music.
Hey, Siri. How many miles have I walked?
You've walked or run 2.2 miles today.
She loves chocolate.
You might have overdone your chocolate load there.
Never.
And she is completely beloved by all of her family.
I'm most proud of the kids I raised.
Well, I'm so glad that you were able to talk to Mitch. What did she tell you about her experience at Tule Lake and how she met Ma'am?
She didn't go into much detail about the hardships that she experienced at Tule Lake. But the first thing that she did want to tell us was
That's where I met my future husband,
he was what she called
the G-man, garbage man.
and his job in the camp was to make the rounds driving the garbage truck around the camp. They lived on opposite sides of the camp, but it happened that
We had some Hood River people living in our block, and he introduced us.
Ma'am would drive his truck around and visit his friends from Hood River, and
He used to come and see me.
Many Japanese Americans today regard this period as a very traumatic time in their family histories. Tule Lake was known for its poor living conditions, the difficulty of life there. Still, Mitch remembers her time there with a remarkably positive outlook. At first, I found this kind of surprising, but then I learned other Japanese Americans who were kids or teenagers while incarcerated in camps have expressed similar experiences. Mitsuko, or Mitzi Asai Loftus, also grew up on an orchard in Hood River, and she was 9 years old when Japanese Americans were first incarcerated during the war.
I was just happy to have all these kids to play with. And all this time, as I look back, I'm thinking about my parents worrying about, are our sons going to get killed in the war? And so they were thinking, worrying about those things while I was having a great fun time with my friends.
Satsuki Ina was born incarcerated at Tule Lake. She's a retired family therapist and has participated in multiple pilgrimages to the former site of the camp in remembrance of what happened there, where she's met a lot of other survivors.
Especially now, the survivors were teenagers there, and many teenagers that I interview and talk to now will say, oh, no, it wasn't traumatic because I got to go to dances, I met my boyfriend there, but their parents suffered a great deal. And I tell them, you have good memories because of your parents.
Jeff, in the course of researching and filming this story, talking to the Kiyokawas, did you get a sense that there is a generational difference in how members of Japanese American families think and talk about this period, about incarceration?
in talking to the Kiyokawas and to Linda Tamura, who interviewed many, many families from the Hood River Valley, there was definitely a difference that they experienced when talking to family members who were older at the time versus those like Mitch who were teenagers.
It was very difficult on the parents. For the younger folks, yes, they got pulled out of school or colleges, but they made the best of it. That's where mom and dad met. So that's the attitude they've always had.
Randy and Connie told us that they had both experienced this with their own family.
They had told us we don't cry over spilled milk, so we didn't get that much information until much later. And even then, not too much.
Their grandparents really didn't talk about what they had gone through. Randy told us that his grandfather and grandmother had returned, went back to working on the orchard, and never said much about what they had gone through. Linda Tamura found that to be very, very common in other families that she interviewed, not passing on to the kids the hardships that they had experienced.
That was part of the gaman, I think, the perseverance that Issei learned to demonstrate.
So some Japanese Americans who were in prison during World War II lost everything, were unable to return to their businesses or property from before the war.
After the war, less than 40% of the Hood River Issei and Nisei returned to Hood River.
But the Kiyokawas were able to retain land in the Hood River Valley and return to farming there after the war. How were they able to do that?
Randy told us that his grandfather reached out to friends, neighbors. There were many other families who sold their land for whatever price they could get, their farming equipment, all their possessions. Some, like the Kiyokawas, were able to make deals with other landowners.
My grandfather was fortunate enough to lease his land because he knew he was going to be gone and didn't know how long. He was able to make a deal with the Stadelmans.
And they were able to keep it safe until they returned.
My grandfather came back. There was nothing written, nothing too much said, but they came back, continued farming.
And the next generation continued farming too. Mitch and Mam got married in 1945. After the war, Mam worked for the U.S. military for several years. After that, he brought Mitch to the Hood River Valley, where he was able to buy some land in Parkdale thanks to the GI Bill.
Because I'm from Tacoma, I think the first thing I realized was that's the first time I was smelling dirt.
They raised their family on that land, Randy and his 4 sisters. They say it was an idyllic place to grow up.
I like the change of seasons. I also used to like to roam around the orchard. It seemed like we had the world in front of us.
And that's the same land where the Kiyokawa family orchards still live. After Mam's health declined in the 80s, Randy stepped in to take over operation of the orchard.
Even going through high school and even college, I kind of, in the back of my mind, knew that I'd be coming back to the farm.
He's still running things there today. Coming up after a break, we'll get out onto the land and learn about how Randy and his family grow not just 1 or 10, but more than 100 varieties of delicious Hood River apples. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you dig what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning a little bit with something new and interesting to sink your teeth into each week. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPB Photo, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB. That's Jen with 2 N's, and I will keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about Hood River apples and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. You are the sun and the water that help us grow. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the story of the Kiyokawa family orchards. The land where the Kiyokawas grow their fruit, more than 200 acres, is a sight to behold. The view of Mount Hood is just as breathtaking as it was in 1911.
It is a beautiful place. It's so peaceful that all of the grandkids and the great-grandkids, they love to come up here.
The rolling fields of the Kiyokawa family orchards grow a variety of fruits: pears, cherries, peaches, pluots, which are a hybrid of plums and apricots, also plueries, which are plums plus cherries, and which I had never heard of before this very podcast. And of course, what they're best known for.
We grow over 125 varieties of apples. Apples that are heirloom varieties, apples that are from around the world. Some are from people's backyards.
As you might imagine, it's hard for Randy to choose a favorite.
The Zestar is a really good early season. It has that sweet, tangy, complex flavor. Later on, there's nothing like a really good Jonagold, the Mountain Rose, the red flesh apples. Ones from different parts of the world. We have an Elstar apple that's from Holland. Suguru is a very popular apple. It's a Japanese apple.
And fan favorite, myself included, the Honeycrisp.
We put 30 trees of that Honeycrisp in, and it's taken off.
But Jeff, I know the orchard's vast variety of apples didn't happen overnight. What role has Randy played in that?
At the time that Randy took over the orchard, he told us that there were only about 4 varieties of apples. Over the years, that has blossomed into 125. He told us that in 1989, there was a nationwide crash in the apple market, so much so that you could hardly give them away. And so he would put out boxes by the roadside, 5 cents a pound. People started to stop by and request different varieties, and that gave him an idea.
Let's have varieties that people want. Let's get varieties before they even know they want them.
He has a fascination with all the different varieties that you can have in this one fruit, the different textures, different colors, different flavors. And just having all that variety has, over the years, really made it an attractive place for people to come in the fall.
Randy says,
to grow the perfect apple, you have to have the right conditions, the right soil, the right weather, and a lot of luck.
And I want to focus in on one of those, the weather. I was really interested to learn that the area where their orchard is has a unique microclimate that has a lot of implications for growing fruit there. What did you learn about that from Randy?
So Hood River itself sits at about 200 feet of elevation, but Parkdale on the upper end of the valley sits at about 2,000 feet of elevation. And that translates into often several weeks difference in the growing season. It's presented some unique challenges. For one thing, the danger of frost lasts much longer into the spring.
One of the things that we do to protect our bloom is using wind machines. We activated and turn them on during the bud development stages, and especially during the time it's bloom. That's when the blossoms are very susceptible to cold weather.
But that unique microclimate of having just the right amount of rain and the fertile soils and sunshine, Randy has experimented over the years with what types of apples will thrive in that environment. And so far, he's come up with about 125.
Right, yeah.
And growing.
So let's get back to spring, where we started this podcast.
Springtime for us growers, it's a time for hope.
And also a lot of hard work. Jeff, you joined Randy on the orchard last spring as apple growing season was getting underway. What was it like to be there, and what was happening at this time of year on the orchard?
Springtime in the Hood River Valley is probably the most scenic place that I've seen in Oregon. There's a carpet of white and pink blossoms as far as you can see. Mount Hood overlooking all of that. It's really breathtaking. Randy took us out into the orchard.
Most of the employees now, about 20 of them, are helping. We were just finishing up pruning, switching over to planting and grafting.
And they actually do blossom thinning. They don't keep all of the blooms because They want the fruit that remains in the fall to be as perfect as it can be.
As the seasons change, so do things on the orchard. Randy says the summer is a bit of the calm before the storm in terms of apples, but other fruits they offer, cherries and peaches, come into season in the summer. And their farm stand opens on weekends in July, leading up to August when it opens every day. Come fall, it's go time.
The fall is kind of a unique time that you get to finally pick that piece of fruit. It's probably the most rewarding time.
Randy says it's like the trees are screaming out to him.
They're screaming out to me, it's like, pick me, pick me, pick me.
And that's just what he and his employees work very, very hard to do.
It's a buzzing of people out there picking, our own crew harvesting it. We might have a crew picking, other people packing fruit, people pressing, trucks driving down the road with loads of fruit to take to the packing house or to take into Portland.
He says they sell their apples direct to consumer. That includes their farm stand, over a dozen farmers markets, and of course, one of his own innovations, the U-Pick.
Randy's been so forward-thinking with things like the U-Pick block. I don't know that I would have ever thought of a U-Pick block, and he was one of the first ones here in the valley.
You mentioned, Jeff, that in addition to visiting the orchard for this story, that you've long been bringing your own family to pick apples there at the U-Pick. Can you describe what it's like being there during fall and picking apples?
It's one of the best places that I've seen in the fall to bring your family. The U-Pick rows are so fun because there are so many different varieties. They've got some that are red in the middle. They've got one type that's the biggest on the farm called the Hanner's Jumbo, which is so big that you can't fit two hands around it. Just seeing the joy on all the kids' faces as they're picking these apples and loading the carts. Also in the farm stand next door, they're pouring apple cider and they have apple cider donuts. Randy's sisters are usually there working the farm stand, and they have boxes and crates full of just about every kind of apple and pear that you can think of. Randy told us that that is the biggest reward of the year. After all that hard work, getting to see the joy on his customers' faces as they're trying these apples.
It's fun to hear people say, oh, this apple is so good. You got to try this. Come here. And then the other siblings say, no, I found another variety. Come. So it re-energizes my batteries. So I do enjoy that. I enjoy hearing that this is the best apple I've ever had in my life.
And just getting to have that interaction with people is really meaningful to him.
Oh, that's so nice. Very, very important journalism question for you. What is your favorite type of apple from the Kiyokawa family orchards?
My favorite so far, it's really hard to beat the Honeycrisp.
Yes, this is what I'm saying, right?
Just that combination of sweetness and crispness, it's really hard to beat. The Kiyokawas, actually, one weekend of the year, they do an apple tasting festival where they lay out somewhere between 80 and 100 different types of apples. A couple of the new ones that I tried this year, there's one called Sugaru. It's very, very sweet, and that's one of my new favorites. I also tried one of his heirloom varieties called Ashmead's Kernel, and that had more of a complex flavor. Hard to describe, but it's kind of sweet and acidic at the same time. It was really interesting.
People are going to have to try it for themselves. Mm-hmm. You know, another thing happens in the fall that's very important, Mitch's birthday. Last September, you got to spend time with the family on the weekend of her 101st birthday.
I'll be 101 on Tuesday.
Yes. You flipped the odometer.
What was it like to be there to mark that occasion with them?
That weekend actually coincided with the Kiyokawa Honeycrisp Festival, so they had a ton of visitors that weekend. They passed out leis to all the customers in honor of Mitch's birthday. And around Mitch's house, they had decorated everything with a 101 Dalmatians theme. One of our favorite things we filmed for the documentary was lighting Mitch's 101st birthday candles on top of a plate of apples.
Perfect.
And of course, Mitch got to enjoy plenty of her favorite chocolate that weekend.
Good, as it should be.
What's your secret to longevity, Mom?
Chocolate.
For Linda Tamura, who grew up in the Hood River Valley, the Kiyokawa family's story represents something really meaningful.
When I go into Kiyokawa orchards and see the fruit and the busy people excited about the quality of the fruit and making choices about how they were going to use it when they go home, there's some pride that I have in recognizing what they've done. There are few families, Japanese American families in Hood River, who are continuing the legacy of our grandparents and our parents. There's a real joy and power in knowing that this is continuing.
And how do the Kiyokawas think about this, about what the orchard and their work there over generations means to them?
We asked Randy about his family legacy, and he wasn't comfortable with that word legacy.
I don't never consider it to be a legacy. I look at it as my responsibility. I consider us to be survivors.
Continuing to work the land all these years is incredibly meaningful to Randy and his family. Just the fact that they've been here for so many years, farming in this idyllic place and continuing what their grandparents had started.
I'm grateful to my parents and my grandparents on both sides for having the courage of crossing the ocean and coming here and setting up a place that we can live. And it's such a beautiful place. My mom says it's paradise, and it is.
Thank you so much for helping us share the apple growing story of the Kiyokawa family, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
You can see video producer and cinematographer Jeff Kastner's documentary short about the Kiyokawa family orchards in Oregon's Hood River Valley at opb.org/Oregon Experience. The story was a collaboration between Oregon Experience and the OPB video series Super Abundant. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. I produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada, Julie Sabatier, and Sage Van Wing. Jeff Kastner, Arya Soroy-Joyo, Jesse Sears, and Dave Miller did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. If you have a question for us, or want to tell us what your favorite kind of apple is, please reach out. We are all ears. Email us at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.
Do you have any advice?
Advice? Heavens no. You live long enough and you get money back from your, what was that they gave me?
Life insurance.
Life insurance?